Greetings and welcome. Today we're beginning our discussion of right-wing populism and right-wing extremism. One thing which is very remarkable over the politics of Western Europe, Eastern Europe also, Latin America, Asia, and the United States in the past 20 or 30 years is the emergence of political parties and leaders who have emerged to fundamentally challenge the premise of liberal democracy. We've spent 4 weeks talking about what is a liberal democracy and why would liberal democracy be a good solution to the problem of living together in a modern world. And these political parties fundamentally reject the premises of liberal democracy. There are two sets of ideas which are found in these parties, and they don't amount exactly to the same thing. First of all, there is a simplistic kind of populism, which makes the political case that the people are being exploited and mistreated by the elites. And then secondly, there is a right-wing extremism that depends on racism, hatred, and a propensity for violence against members of other groups, which has also emerged as a powerful basis for mobilization in many Western societies, but also in India and some other Asian societies. When these two currents of political development converge, they pose a potent and very dangerous threat to liberal democracy. There is an overlap between populism and right-wing extremism, but they are not exactly the same thing. Racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia may be a basis for populist mobilization. Think of George Wallace in this country, segregation forever. But economic issues also serve as a basis for populist mobilization. Huey Long, the populist politician who was famous for the slogan, "A chicken in every pot." So today and for the next several weeks, we'll be examining the core of right-wing populism, but also at the content and political characteristics of extreme right groups and parties. The occurrence of political violence in the past 10 years is quite shocking in Western democracies, including Germany. Just about a year ago, there were horrible shootings and murders of 9 young people in Hanau, Germany, which is not far from Frankfurt. And the world's attention was once again focused on the extent and the danger posed by right-wing extremism in Germany. The prevalence of right-wing extremist violence in Germany today is shocking, and it is a deadly challenge to the democratic institutions of modern Germany. The justice minister of the country, Christine Lambrecht, declared following the shootings in Hanau, "Far-right terror is the biggest threat to our democracy right now." This is visible in the number and intensity of attacks. And the Hanau shooting was only the most devastating of a number of shootings in the previous 18 months. What are the parties? Well, a party which went from being a tiny fringe party to being a party which is gaining some electoral success is called the Alternative for Germany, AfD, which was founded in 2013. It is a populist party. It is an activist and very aggressive party. It is anti-immigrant, anti-foreigner. It minimizes or denies the Holocaust. It laughs and scoffs at the idea of Germany's responsibility for mass murder. It is also skeptical about the European Union. It rejects the idea of multiculturalism, and it is profoundly nationalistic. It is connected to the Pegida movement, which is an anti-Islam political movement in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. A second party, much smaller, is called the National Democratic Party, or NPD, founded in 1964, which is a post-fascist party. It is far-right, extremist, and very small. Is it politically irrelevant? Well, that is a very good question because of the rise of appeal that right-wing and extremist ideas and actions appear to be having in Germany today. But Germany is not the only country which is affected by right-wing extremism. Poland, the Netherlands, other countries are also witnessing the rise of substantial and increasingly powerful political movements, political parties. But in France in particular, the Front National, FN, founded in 1972, has become a powerful and popular voice of nationalism and racism in France. Its founder, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was an ultra-nationalist. He was xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-Semite, and minimized the Holocaust. The party, after the founding in 1972, continued to use slogans of the French fascists from the 1930s, and it was referred to as a far-right or neo-fascist organization. And in spite of that, by 1995, it was able to achieve 15% of the vote in the presidential election. The much more media-savvy daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, named Marine Le Pen, understood that the party was being held back by its association with fascism. So she did the work of repackaging, re-messaging the party in 2011 to avoid the extreme racism, the extreme anti-Semitism of her father. In 2012, the party gained 18% of the vote in the presidential election. That fraction rose to 25% in the 2014 elections for the European Parliament. So the Front National is a significant political force in France. What are the ideas, what are the political messages which hold together right-wing extremist movements? Well, there are several. Anti-immigrant language and policies, especially in Europe, but also in the United States. This is a foundational premise of right-wing extremism. White supremacy, racism, is another premise. Racist language, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry. Also, the rejection of political and civic equality of all human beings. Rejection of the democratic ideals that we've been discussing. And then finally, a disturbing willingness to support the use of violence to gain, quote, freedom. Cas Mudde, in the book that you're reading now and this week and next week, describes extreme right ideologies in these terms. Extreme right ideologies believe that inequalities are natural and outside the purview of the state. They celebrate difference and hierarchy, and their core feature is elitism, which holds that some groups and individuals are superior to others and should therefore have more power. Another related description, whether informed primarily by racism or ethno-pluralism, one of the key ideological features of the far right and the dominant feature of contemporary populist radical right is nativism, a combination of nationalism and xenophobia. It is an ideology that holds that states should be inhabited exclusively by members of the native group, the nation, and that non-native or alien elements, whether persons or ideas, are fundamentally threatening to the homogeneous nation-state. The core idea of nativism is best summarized in the slogan, "Germany for the Germans, foreigners out," which became infamous as a rallying cry at the often violent anti-refugee rallies of the early 1990s in Germany. Continuing with a quote from the far right today, within nativism, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia play particularly important roles. Anti-Semitism, or hostility to or prejudice against Jews, was the key prejudice of the far right in the early 20th century and remains central to many extreme right groups today. However, many populist radical right groups and parties, particularly in Western Europe, are not anti-Semitic, and some have even become philo-Semitic or pro-Jewish, seeing Israel as the ideal ethnocracy and Jews as natural allies in the struggle against Islam. Islamophobia, an irrational fear of Islam or Muslims, has become the defining prejudice of the far right of the fourth wave of radical right ideology. In this view, Islam is equated with Islamism, that is, an extremist political interpretation of Islam, and Muslims are seen as uniformly hostile to democracy and to all non-Muslims. And what about violence? The extreme right is especially prone to violence. Quoting again from the same book, the far right is commonly associated with violence, be it larger populist radical right parties or smaller extreme right groups and individuals. However, those who primarily perpetrate far-right violence have traditionally not been the leaders within politically relevant organizations, but small groups of individuals who have at best a peripheral association with the far-right movement. Nevertheless, in recent years, far-right violence has become more planned, regular, and lethal as terrorist attacks in, among others, Christchurch, New Zealand, Pittsburgh, United States, and Utøya, Norway, show. And in the wake of the, quote, refugee crisis, more and more countries are growing increasingly concerned about the rise of far-right terrorist groups, such as the German National Socialist Underground. In this country, there is a rising concern about political violence by extreme right organizations. And there's I guess you could call it an observatory of political violence at the U.S. military, at West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, which has classified far-right violence in the United States into three basic categories. First of all, racist violence, Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi organizations, skinhead groups. Secondly, anti-federalist violence. Quoting from them, ideologically, anti-federalists are interested in undermining the influence, legitimacy, and practical sovereignty of the federal government and its proxy organizations. The Bundy brothers' occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge is an example from 3-4 years ago. A third category is what they refer to as the fundamentalist trend. Quoting from them, the fundamentalist trend, which includes mainly Christian identity groups such as the Aryan nations, merges religious fundamentalism with traditional white supremacy and racist tendencies. It promotes ideas of nativism, exclusionism, and racial superiority via a unique interpretation of religious texts that focus on division of humanity according to primordial attributes. After the Capitol riot, January 6th, it would appear that U.S. Security and police organizations are finally paying a fair amount of attention to the potential for right-wing violence in the United States. But quoting again from Moody, far-right paramilitary groups are particularly prone to political violence, including outright terrorism. Most European paramilitary units are uniformed, but officially not armed. Several were set up by far-right political parties, such as the Hungarian Guard, the banned but still operating paramilitary wing of Jobbik, the LN's Green Shirts in northern Italy, and the National Party's National Guard in the Czech Republic. While these groups rarely engage in overt physical violence, their mere presence in formation, often wearing black uniforms with black boots, carrying torches, and accompanied by dogs, is aimed at terrorizing targeted populations, mostly immigrants and Roma. And this is so reminiscent of the displays in Lansing last spring, and of course the display and riot in the Capitol. In Lansing, heavily armed men in combat gear invading the Michigan State House and eventually invading, not with firearms, but with other kinds of weapons, invading the US Capitol. Quoting again from Moody, in sharp contrast, most of all countries have a fertile breeding ground for populist radical right ideas and organizations. Nativist, authoritarian, and populist attitudes are widespread, with often pluralities, sometimes even majorities, expressing support for key populist radical right policies like less immigration, tougher sentences, and fewer perks for politicians. In the article, I've asked you to read just a few pages of this article because it gives a good definition of populism, which I'm turning to now. Cas Mudde gives a good short definition. I define populism as an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, or general will, of the people. Populism, so defined, has two opposites, elitism and pluralism. Pluralism rejects the homogeneity of both populism and elitism, seeing society as a heterogeneous collection of groups and individuals with often fundamentally different views and wishes. And recall, Rawls believes that pluralism is a fundamental characteristic of a liberal democracy. But according to the populists, pluralism is the enemy. Quoting from Mudde and Kaltwasser in a book that you haven't read, it's the short introduction to populism. What they write is, pluralism is the direct opposite of the dualist perspective of both populism and elitism, instead holding that society is divided into a broad variety of partly overlapping social groups with different ideas and interests. Within pluralism, diversity is seen as a strength rather than a weakness. Pluralists believe that a society should have many centers of power, and that politics, through compromise and consensus, should reflect the interests and values of as many different groups as possible. Thus, the main idea is that power is supposed to be distributed throughout society in order to avoid specific groups, be they men, ethnic communities, economic, intellectual, military, or political cadres, etc., acquiring the capacity to impose their will upon the others. This is the value of pluralism, according to Mudde and Kaltwasser, but also according to Rawls. And populism makes for a kind of an extreme simplification of who the people are. And in fact, what it turns out to be is people who are like us, white, middle class, lower middle class, and people who kind of see each other as belonging to the same group. Populist parties and leaders glorify a mythical conception of the people in opposition to elites. Quoting, "It is worth noting that this meaning of the people tends to be both integrative and divisive. Not only does it attempt to unite an angry and silent majority, but it tries to mobilize this majority against a defined enemy." This is an easy figurative translation from the people to people like us to white people, German people, or religious people. And the implication is that the real people of a country are defined in racial, ethnic, or religious terms. So what about the elites as defined by populism? Elites are defined as others, those others that we don't really know, who wield power, privilege, access, prestige, status, and influence. They are defined in derogatory ways. They are different from us. They don't care about us. They manipulate the system for their own advantage. Government, business, media, the arts, the press, influential people in all of these fields are denounced as elites. Anti-elite language sometimes slides into anti-Semitic stereotypes, for example, in the right-wing war of words against George Soros. But it comes into the idea of Main Street versus Wall Street as well. Populism is, in its nature, a grievance-driven politics. It depends for its support on the grievances of various groups of people: anti-immigrant complaints, anti-globalization complaints, anti-affirmative action complaints, anti-big business complaints. and politically savvy leaders and advisors craft their messages so as to cultivate and deepen these grievances and to mobilize support around them. And you don't have to be a deep observer of American politics in the past 4 years and 8 years and 20 years to see exactly how conservative leaders have attempted to make use of these sorts of grievances to support their electoral ambitions. So what about the populist leaders? The oversimplification of the ills of society into the people, good, and the corrupt elites, bad, this oversimplification has a natural affinity with authoritarianism, or one-person rule, the cult of the leader. And recall, President Trump said, "Only I can solve your problems." A charismatic leader makes the case that he or she alone understands the needs and wants of the people. He or she alone will stand up to the elites. He or she alone will speak truth to power. By describing politicians as corrupt elites, the leader discredits elected politicians and the institutions of representative democracy. The message coming from the populist leader is that the elected politicians won't help you. They are in the pockets of the powerful. Give me the power. I will make sure your interests are furthered. And we can see this in many different examples of populist leaders, both in the United States, in Latin America, in Poland, in other countries. So there's a poisonous kind of synergy between right-wing populism and right-wing extremism. Populism is a powerful platform for mobilizing support for a prospective leader, working on cultivating resentment between the people and the elites. And right-wing extremism is a toxic mix of social beliefs and attitudes that embody racism, ethnic supremacy, and a willingness to use violence against a group's enemies. Both political ideologies are deeply opposed to the values of liberal democracy. When right-wing extremism is brought into a populist movement or party, the resulting political movement is toxic to democracy. It depends on division, hate, and antagonism, and there is a very large toolbox of strategies available to the politicians who attach themselves to such a movement. So a question that we'll be asking in greater detail in the next several weeks, who supports populist parties and populist activists? And there are lots of theories about what the motivations of populist followers, the people who come out for populist rallies. Racial and ethnic resentment is one, and kind of an obvious one. Economic dissatisfaction and a perception of unfair exclusion is a second. A nationalist identity, the idea of France for the French or Arizona for the Arizonans. A kind of related idea of cultural primevalism. Keep our culture pure. Don't adulterate our Dutch culture by allowing Muslim people into the Netherlands. And then special issues which motivate some groups of individuals, concerns about abortion, gun ownership, affirmative action, taxes, and so forth. But then we also have to recognize the role of right-wing media in promoting populism. So we'll spend some time in the next several weeks trying to figure out what the grievances and what the political psychology of grievance is, which leads large numbers of individuals to support right-wing extremists. This is the last slide, and it's in a way a little premature for us to give a conclusion, but I think it's worth underlining that Cas Mudde believes that a lot of what liberal and progressive commentators have had to say about populism and the extreme right is maybe counterproductive. He believes that it's important for the whole of society to strengthen our democratic institutions rather than simply trying to constrain the expressions of right-wing populism. Quoting from The Far Right Today, Mudde writes, this is towards the end of the book, "The ultimate goal of all responses to the far right should be the strengthening of liberal democracy. Put simply, Only fighting the far right does not necessarily strengthen liberal democracy, but strengthening liberal democracy will, by definition, weaken the far right. That the two do not always go hand in hand is not always acknowledged. Limiting free speech or the right to demonstrate not only infringes on the democratic rights of far-right activists, it undermines those rights in general and thereby the liberal democratic regime. This is not even to speak of the tendency for repressive measures aimed at one group to be later applied to other groups, including some that are neither radical nor right. But it is also clear, and I think January 6th makes it even more clear, that we have to add to this defense of John Stuart Mill-style liberalism, we have to add the point that it is simply mandatory to make full and legal use of police and police services to prevent acts of violence and terrorism. Any law-based society depends upon an ability to prevent people from exercising violent means against each other, and a liberal democracy requires that as well.